Chapter 40 of Officer 666. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. Officer 666 by Barton W. Currie and Augustin McHugh. Chapter 40. Striking While the Iron is Hot. As Travers Gladwin skimmed up the stairs to warn Helen of the arrival of her aunt, he was thinking on four sides of his brain at the same time and revolving together so many lightning plans that the result was a good deal of a jumble. In consequence, he was wild-eyed, out of breath, and more than a trifle incoherent when he parted the crimson curtains of the den and precipitately entered. "Your aunt," he began as he checked his momentum and stopped against a table beside which Miss Barton was seated. "But don't get up, and don't be frightened. She need never know. I'll take the blame for everything. I am the Travers Gladwin you are going to elope with, and I'll go to jail if necessary." He paused for breath while Helen rose from her chair and protested. "Impossible, Mr. Gladwin. "Nothing of the sort," the young man stopped her. "It is perfectly possible, and I only wish that I were the man you had chosen to elope with. I'd elope with you now, in a minute, aunt or no aunt." "You must not talk that way," cried the young girl, her face aflame. "You are only saying this out of politeness, a sense of chivalry, and while I appreciate all you are doing for me, I could not accept any such sacrifice." "Sacrifice?" he retorted, with increasing ardor. "Call it a blessing, call it heavenly boon. Call it the pinnacle of my desire, the apogee of my hopes. Call it anything in the world but sacrifice." "Oh, you must not talk to me this way," exclaimed the girl, sinking back into her chair and covering her face with her hands. "But I certainly must," the young man reeled on. "It is the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. It has come upon me like a stroke of lightning. It may not seem reasonable. It may not seem sane. I can't help that. It is here, inside of me." "Stop," Helen interposed again, her voice faint and tremulous. "You are taking advantage of my helpless situation. Why, you hardly know me," she added, with a swift change of tone, as if she had made a sudden discovery. Taking her hands from her face, she looked up at him through widening eyes misty with tears. The young man bit his lip and turned his head away. "Pardon me," he said bitterly after a moment's pause. "I had not thought of it in that light. It does seem as if I were taking advantage of you." He looked at her steadily a moment until she dropped her eyes. "Can you think I am that sort of a man?" he asked abruptly, and the tenseness of his voice made her glance up at him again. Helen made another remarkable discovery, that he had fine eyes and a splendid mouth and nose. "Can you think I am that sort of a man?" he repeated slowly, forcing her to continue to yield her eyes to his earnest regard. "No, no," Helen returned hastily. "I did not mean it that way, only I cannot quite understand it. You never saw me till a few hours ago, and then I was engaged." She paused and shuddered. "But that was a case of hypnotism," burst out the young man, letting himself go again. "He is a marvelous man. I wish I had half of his strength of will and good looks. It is past belief that he is who he is, with all his talents, his appearance and his magnificent courage. If it is in my power, the police shall not reach him. At first my only object was to save you from the dreadful position of becoming the wife of such a man, and also from the scandal that must have followed if your elopement were discovered and he were arrested. But now I must confess that the man compels my admiration, and that I want to see him free for his own sake." And he is still in the house? Said Helen anxiously. Yes, yes, and here comes your aunt. Now, I pray you, let me take the brunt of this storm. I will ask nothing more of you. I am Travers Gladwin, and we were to have eloped. Do you promise? For here she is. Yes, Helen whispered, and then the storm burst. So here you are at last, Helen Burton, came the first roll of thunder from the doorway. It was not as terrifying a rumble as it might have been, had not the statuesque and tightly laced Mrs. Burton lost a good deal of breath in coming up the stairs. She came on into the room with tragic step, followed by Whitney Barnes and Sadie, the latter keeping very close to Barnes, as if she feared that her cousin would cover her with reproaches for having revealed the secret of the projected elopement. Calm yourself, madam, calm yourself, began Travers Gladwin as he stepped between her and her niece. And who are you, pray? Asked the majestic woman haughtily. I am to blame for it all, he cried. I am Travers Gladwin. What? You are Travers Gladwin? You are the wretch who sought to steal off in the dead of night with my niece and ward? You? You? Mrs. Burton looked unutterable threats and maledictions. Travers Gladwin could not resist a smile, which he hid by bowing low and stammering, I must humbly confess to being myself, and plead guilty of the crime of falling passionately in love with your niece. Helen rose quickly to her feet and confronted her aunt. There was fire in the young girl's eye as she said, Aunt Ella, it is all a mistake. This Now, Helen, Gladwin turned and took the young girl's hand. Please let me explain. You promised. She promised what? Flared Mrs. Burton. She foolishly promised to elope with me, said Gladwin sweetly, but when she got here and thought of the shock and grief that her dear aunt might suffer, she suddenly changed her mind. I had everything arranged, car waiting, parson waiting, marriage license in my pocket, everything. You see, madam, I am the only guilty party. Your niece was the innocent victim of my wiles. Mrs. Burton looked from one to the other in complete bewilderment. Helen could only blush and look confused. The immensity of Gladwin's lie struck her dumb. Sadie was staring at him in open-mouthed amazement. Even Whitney Barnes blinked his eyes and forgot his handcuffs. Travers Gladwin met Mrs. Burton's frowning and perplexed stare with a fatuous smile. At last she turned to Whitney Barnes and asked, Is he telling the truth? Oh, yes, said Barnes readily. And if it hadn't been for me, he might have kidnapped her. He's almost as madly in love with her as I am. You will have to excuse me a moment. I think I see that man Ryan. The shackled young man suddenly darted out of the room, followed by Sadie, who seemed irresistibly drawn in his wake. Mrs. Burton looked after them helplessly. A suspicion suddenly flashed in her brain, and she turned back to Gladwin. I feel sure that you are deceiving me, she charged him, and that other young man is Travers Gladwin. You can't tell me that his wrists were not handcuffed, for I just saw them. You are entirely mistaken, Gladwin returned soberly. If you will kindly step out into the music room, I will show you a modest portrait of myself that was painted 3 years ago by an eminent American artist. Helen, you will pardon us for just a moment? And he turned with a broad smile that won him a smile in return, for the humor of the situation had gradually beaten down whatever other emotions stirred in the girl's breast. Like one reluctantly led in a dream, Mrs. Burton allowed Gladwin to escort her into the music room outside and conduct her to a painting that hung in an obscure corner of the room. Do you think it flatters me?" he asked, as she regarded it dumbly. She looked at him curiously, and then back at the portrait, then shook her head and muttered: "There's a mystery here somewhere. You are all banded together in a conspiracy. I do not know whom to believe. But it has gone far enough. We will go back to Omaha tomorrow. I had no idea New York was such a terrible place. Why are all these policemen running about?" "Mainly in your interest," responded Gladwin quickly. "But if you will consent not to send me to jail, I will get them out of the house and keep the unhappy termination of my romance out of the newspapers." "Of course it must not get in the newspapers," cried the horrified Mrs. Burton. "Then, madam, if you will go back to Helen and promise not to be too hard with her, I will attend to it." "Was your father's name Edwin Gladwin?" asked Mrs. Burton, looking at him with a swift change of expression as he led her back to the room he called his den. "Yes," said the young man. "But if you will excuse me, I will endeavor to get rid of all these policemen." He suddenly darted from her and descended the stairs. End of chapter 40. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 41 of Officer 666. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. Officer 666 by Barton W. CURRIE and Augustin McHugh. Chapter 41. The Escape. While he had not the slightest notion where the picture expert had managed to conceal himself during his own enforced absence from the scene of the chase, Travers Gladwin was confident that the man was capable of outwitting an army of the sort of man-hunters who were swarming within and without the aristocratic premises. When he caught sight of Whitney Barnes and Sadie in a tender confab that was just about to frond out into the full foliage of a romantic climax, it was on his tongue to bid them carry their hearts upstairs and string them together in a more secluded spot. They beat him to his own suggestion, and were gone before he could utter a syllable. He had the great drawing-room and picture gallery to himself, and was scanning every corner of it when a voice punctuated the silence. "Ah, Mr. Gladwin!" The young man turned quickly and saw what he at first mistook for a uniformed constable emerge from the portieres that screened the window. "Well, if it isn't—" he began in gaping surprise. "Murphy, sir, only a tighter fit." Wilson stepped through the curtains twirling his club. "So you are 666 now, eh?" Gladwin blurted. "And Phelan—" "The gentleman who belongs in this tight-fitting frock? Oh, he's still about." "And you managed to bribe him?" "Not exactly that, Mr. Gladwin. Say I persuaded him." "My hat is off to you again," exclaimed the young man. "But don't waste any time. You can get away easily in that uniform. Quick, and good luck." "I never hurry in these cases," returned the thief, with an air of calm indifference. "You see, I have an idea that the captain and Kearney are waiting for me at the front door, for they made a loud declaration that they were going to search the cellar. I have had similar experiences, my young friend." "But they won't leave the front door, and they may burst in here at any moment," protested Gladwin. "But they will leave the front door when I want them to," said the other softly. "By Jove, you're a wonderful chap." "I've got to be, to keep out of jail." "It's a shame that you misdirect your energies and genius," said the young man earnestly. "But you must acknowledge that I work hard for what I get." "Yes, I do." "And I really love pictures. For themselves?" Yes, for themselves." Travers Gladwin stood frowning at the floor for a moment, then looked up quickly. "See here, then. You've worked mighty hard for my pictures, and I'm going to give you a few of the best of them. Here." And Gladwin stepped over to the corner of the room where the trunk had been dropped and picked up a bundle of canvases. The picture expert wore a broad grin as the young man came toward him. He waved aside the proffered bundle and said, "Those are not the best of 'em. Just a minute." He reached behind him and pulled down from under his belted coat a similar carefully rolled bundle. "These are the gems of your collection," he said grimly, offering the slim roll of canvases. "I can't keep them now. You've been too white about this whole thing. I couldn't even accept The Blue Boy." Gladwin refused to accept the paintings, and the thief laid them down on the table. Stepping closer to the young man, he bent down and said low and earnestly, "When a man goes wrong, Gladwin, and the going leans against the lines of least resistance, it's easier to keep on going than to stop and switch off into the hard and narrow path. He is always hoping that something will take hold of him and set him right, and that hope usually involves a woman. I've been dreaming lately that I wanted something to set me going in the right direction, but it seems that you have beaten me to that, or are on the fair road to do it. The trouble is that I have forgotten how to go about a clean thing cleanly." "I'm mighty sorry, but—" Gladwin started. "But you're also mighty glad." "I shall always remember you, Wilson, and here's my hand on it that I shall always be willing to help you up and out of the muck," supplied the thief, accepting Gladwin's hand and gripping it. "However, we are wasting time and keeping the ladies up till an unconscionable hour. If you will get your little Jap down here without making a noise about it, I can use him and bid you good night." Gladwin went warily out into the hallway, reconnoitered the front door and vestibule, then went to the stairway and uttered a short, sharp whistle. Battiato came down as if on winged feet, and halted as if turned to stone between the big man in the uniform of Officer 666 and his master. "Come here," said Wilson, and plucked the Jap by the arm. Battiato trembled with apprehension. "Would you like to catch the thief?" the picture expert asked him. "Yes, sir." Battiato looked at his master, who nodded reassuringly. "Well, the thief is in your master's room," said Wilson impressively. "Go up there and bang on the door. Take that poker out of the fireplace and make all the noise you can. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir," and Battiato's long-lost grin returned. "I make bang, bang." "Yes, and yell, 'Police, quick, 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 catch thief.'" "Yes, sir. Big much police come and thief run. Battiato run too, and police find all empty." "Good. Hurry!" and Wilson gave the Jap an unnecessary push toward the fireplace, for the little Oriental fairly flew on his errand. A moment later there burst upon the stillness of the mansion a frightful uproar. The noise was distinctly audible in the street, as Wilson had slipped to the door and opened it, then concealed himself behind a curtain. It was only a matter of seconds before Captain Stone, Kearney, and the entire outside patrol rushed in and piled up the stairs. Travers Gladwin had not stirred from where he stood in the drawing-room when Battiato got his instructions. He was intensely excited and feared that some slip might spoil his inspired plan. "Good-bye," came a muffled hail from the hallway. Then there was silence, both within and without. "Gad, I hope he makes it," cried the young man, and rushed to the window. He had hardly reached there when the stillness was punctured by a crash of shifting gears and the racket of a 60-horsepower engine thrown into sudden, furious action. "He's gone," Gladwin breathed, as he saw a touring car hurl itself athwart his vision. He recognized his former servant, Watkins, at the wheel. End of chapter 41. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 42 of Officer 666. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. Officer 666 by Barton W. Currie and Augustin McHugh. Chapter 42. Michael Phelan's Predicament. It was as if a great burden had been removed from his shoulders. Leaving the window and stepping back into the room, Travers Gladwin stretched his arms above his head and exhaled a long breath of satisfaction. "Now I can sit down and await developments," he said to himself, slipping into a chair and stretching out his legs. "And it will only remain for Michael Phelan to turn up or to fail to turn up, and the mystery of the escape is explained. Poor Phelan, he must be a terrific simpleton, and I suppose I am partly to blame." His gaze had wandered to the great chest, the lid of which was distinctly rising. Before Gladwin could jump to his feet, the lid was thrown back, and there sat the subject of his soliloquy in his shirt sleeves, jerking his head about like a jack-in-the-box. "Where in blazes am I?" he groaned as his eyes made out Travers Gladwin. "You seem to be in the chest," replied the young man, covering his mouth with his hand. "Holy murther! Me uniform is gone again!" exploded Phelan, struggling to his feet and examining his shirt sleeves as if he feared he were the victim of witchcraft. He climbed out of the chest and turned a vindictive glance upon Gladwin, who composed his features and said, "Not guilty this time, officer." Phelan stared at him stupidly for a second, and then let his arms and shoulders go limp. He was a lugubriously pathetic figure as he turned up his eyes and muttered, "Now I remember. They took it off me and drugged me and rammed me into the chest. Wurra, I'm a goner now for sure." Gladwin was about to speak when there was a run of feet on the stairs, and in burst Captain Stone and Detective Kearney. At the sight of Phelan, the captain recoiled and his jaw dropped. Kearney likewise regarded him in blank astonishment. "Where's your uniform, Phelan?" roared Captain Stone when he could get his breath. "They took it off me. Drugged me and half murdered me. 8 of 'em," whined Phelan. "8 of 'em," yelled the captain. "There was only 1 of them, you numbskull." "I hope to croak if there wasn't 2 of 'em with the strength of 8, rejoined Phelan, wiping his dripping forehead and rolling his eyes. "And they chloroformed me and stuffed me into the chest. You can ask Mr. Gladwin." "If you let that thief escape in your uniform, Mike Phelan," stormed the infuriated captain, "I'll break you tomorrow. And as for you, Mr. Gladwin, if you had a hand in this—" "Calm yourself, Captain," returned the young man. "I am unable to claim the honor. I just happened in here as Mr. Phelan was coming out of the chest." "Why did that Jap make such a thundering racket upstairs?" broke in Kearney. "The whole thing looks to me like a frame-up." Travers Gladwin shrugged his shoulders and said easily, "Considering the number of policemen on the job, does it not also take on the aspect of a slip-up? It would make rather amusing reading in the newspapers, but if you prefer, gentlemen, we can let the matter drop right here." Captain Stone and Kearney looked at each other and found no comfort in each other's countenances. Even though he got away with $100,000 worth of my paintings slipping out from under your very noses," Gladwin pressed his advantage, "I may, for the sake of avoiding notoriety, decide that it is best to keep the thing quiet. Of course, it is in your power to compel publicity." "Not against your wishes, sir," said Captain Stone meekly. "And you, Mr. Kearney?" smiled the young man, looking up into the frowning visage of the much-advertised Central Office man. "Captain Stone is my superior officer," said Kearney shortly, through compressed lips. "Very well, then, Captain," Gladwin ran on. "We will just drop the incident from our minds. You will oblige me by calling off your men at once." Captain Stone bowed and left the room, followed by Kearney. "Well, Phelan," said Gladwin, turning to that distressed individual, "the evening's entertainment seems at an end." "'Tis a devil of an entertainment for me. I'll be broke tomorrow." "Oh, no, Phelan," and the young man walked over and patted him on the shoulder. "Not broke. You'll resign." "A swell chance I've got to resign, with no shield to turn in. It'll break the heart of me poor old mother." There were tears in Michael Phelan's voice, and his woebegone expression was pitiable. Young Gladwin hastened to cheer him up. "I will take it upon myself to see that you are honorably discharged, Phelan. I can almost swear that a little note to Captain Stone, with an enclosure of, say, 4 figures, will put through your resignation." "But I'll be out of a job, won't I?" flared Phelan. "Not for a minute. I am going to give you a job for life." "What?" "Yes, and at twice the salary you were getting. I'm going to appoint you my private watchman to guard my picture gallery." "Sure, and this ain't one of your jokes?" Phelan asked, with a dismal effort to summon a grin. "Indeed it is not, and here is that $500 bill you so foolishly surrendered to my friend the picture expert. Now, as all your fellow officers seem to have departed, you can begin your duties by going upstairs and telling the ladies that the blockade has been raised." By the time Michael Phelan got the crisp saffron bill tucked away in his jeans, he was in full and glorious grin and made for the stairway with an agility that was a distinct revelation of hidden resources. A few minutes later Mrs. Barton entered the room, followed by her 2 nieces. As her now calmer eye took in the room and the empty picture frames, Mrs. Barton exclaimed, "Whatever have you been doing here?" "Some of my canvases need cleaning," was the ready response, with a wink at Whitney Barnes, who was hovering about Sadie. "So I took the most valuable ones out of the frames to send them to the cleaners." Mrs. Barton swallowed the fib and began a tour of inspection of the room. "Your father collected some of these, didn't he?" she said after a pause. "Your father and my father were very good friends. I remember not so long ago hearing him tell of that portrait of your ancestor," indicating the steward. "Now I like this one, a Gainsborough, isn't it?" She had stopped in front of The Blue Boy. "Do you like that one?" cried the young man. "It's charming," gushed Mrs. Barton. "It's yours." "Mine? Why, I couldn't think of it." "Please do me the honor of accepting it." "After what has occurred tonight? Why, Mrs. Barton couldn't take her eyes from the picture and seemed thrilled with an ecstasy of admiration. "I will have it packed and shipped to you tomorrow." Mrs. Barton wheeled upon him with an expression that fairly took him to her arms. "You dear, generous boy!" she cried. "If Helen had only confided in me. Here is my card. Come to me tomorrow, and we will have a family conference. Auntie, interposed Helen in alarm. I will take charge of all the wedding arrangements, ran on Auntie, fairly bubbling over. Come early in the afternoon, Mr. Gladwin. I must get my girls to bed. Good night. Come, girls. Mrs. Burton started for the door, and Helen lingered behind. Oh, whatever shall I do? She whispered to Gladwin. Whatever your heart dictates, he whispered in reply. And did he escape? Came the frightened query, as she dropped her eyes and blushed. Yes, and they will never get him. Thank you. She gave him her hand for a moment and was gone. End of chapter 42. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 43 of Officer 666. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. Officer 666 by Barton W. Currie and Augustin McHugh. Chapter 43. The Circumvention of Auntie. Sadie sat up with a start and rubbed her eyes. All right, Nanette, she said sleepily. I'm awake. The trim, rosy-cheeked maid smiled and swiftly left the room. She had deposited one armful of fluffy things on a chair beside Sadie's bed, and another armful of fluffy things on a chair beside Helen's bed. She had also performed other mysterious little offices noiselessly before going to the side of Sadie's bed. And sleeping like an innocent babe, said the comely Nanette to herself with a depth of affection in her tone. Then she bent down and called in Sadie's ear, 10 o'clock, Miss Sadie. She had to repeat the whispered call several times before Sadie's eyelids fluttered and she stirred into life. The maid had vanished by the time the younger of the two sleeping beauties had removed the cobwebs from their eyes. The twin rosewood beds lay side by side, enveloped by the transparent silken hangings of a single canopy. The room was exquisitely done in pink, and everywhere were evidences that the two lucky mortals who slumbered therein were coddled and pampered to the limit of modern luxury. Sadie's robe de nuit, as the fashion magazines put it, was a creation of laces and ribbons and mighty becoming. She had admitted this to herself as she surveyed her reflection in the tall oval mirror only 5 hours before. She admitted it again as she hopped out of bed and confronted herself in the same mirror. Then she turned and ran quickly to the side of Helen's bed. She bent down and kissed her cousin. Get up, Helen, Sadie urged, as the blue eyes reluctantly opened. Get up and dress, dear. We haven't much time. Much time for what? Asked Helen, sitting up and going through the ceremony of rubbing her eyes. Much time before Auntie awakes. A roseate blush spread up from the ribbons at Sadie's throat to the roots of her fair hair. Helen's eyes were wide open now, and she looked at her cousin in frowning puzzlement. And Mr. Hogg is expected, said Sadie, with swift inspiration. Whatever are you driving at? Asked Helen. Are you anxious to greet Mr. Hogg? Pouted Sadie. No, was the vehement response. Then we must be out when he comes, and I have an important engagement at 11. Helen shot 2 little pink feet out of the covers and planked them down on the velvety rug. Whom have you an engagement with, Sadie Burton? She asked, with breathless eagerness. I have an engagement to elope. This time Sadie turned her head to hide her blushes. Helen seemed actually paralyzed. There was an intense pause before Sadie wheeled round, flung her head defiantly, and said with more fire than she had ever in her life displayed, "With Mr. Whitney Barnes, and you are going to assist me, you and Mr. Gladwin." "You cannot be serious, Sadie," said the older cousin slowly. "I am, though," was the passionate rejoinder. "Nanette and I packed my steamer trunk after you and Auntie went to bed. Hurry now, Helen dear, for we must be at the little church around the corner at 11 o'clock. I am going to wear my gray traveling dress and you your brown." "Why, you dreadful little minx, you!" cried Helen. "If you are poking fun at me, I will never forgive you." "I am not poking fun," retorted Sadie, with the same ardor and almost in tears. "It is all planned and arranged. Whitney promised to have everything ready at the church, including Travers Gladwin. He said he couldn't wait another minute after 11 o'clock, that the suspense would kill him, and he was so terribly in earnest about it that I believe him." "You goose!" exclaimed Helen, but now she was smiling and there was a happy light in her eyes. "Do you mean to tell me, Sadie Burton," she added, "that you fell in love with that young man in a few hours? You, the man-hater?" "Yes," admitted Sadie, her cheeks again on fire. "And a man you don't know anything about? A perfect stranger?" This brought the fire into the timid Miss's eyes, and she returned warmly, "I know everything about him, Helen Burton, his whole family history, and he is only obeying orders in rushing the ceremony." "Obeying orders?" "Yes. His father commanded him to marry me at once, and if he doesn't obey, he will be disinherited and have to become a plumber or something to make a living. His father is Joshua Barnes, the Mustard King. You must have heard of him. When I told Auntie who he was, she almost collapsed, and said something about Joshua Barnes buying and selling 20 hogs. I suppose she meant Jabez Hogg." "Why, I never heard of such a thing, Sadie. Mr. Barnes could not have been serious. His father never saw you in his life." "Oh, but he telephoned his father all about it before he proposed to me. He was sure I would say yes. He is a wonderful mind reader and believes in mysteries and fate. He said the minute he saw me he knew I was his fate." Once more the modest Sadie was in a state bordering on conflagration. Helen's eye sobered as she looked at and beyond Sadie. "That was the very thing Travers Gladwin, I mean the real one, said to me," she mused. "He did?" "Yes, and the way things have turned out, it would seem—" Helen stopped and covered her face with her hands. Sadie ran to her and put her arms about her. "You are going to help us, aren't you, Helen dear?" said Sadie tremulously. "I would tell Auntie about it, only she would want a tremendous wedding and all that. Whitney and I both hate big weddings. I am too timid, and he is too nervous. Says he might swallow the ring and choke to death. You will now, Helen darling?" There was a little sob in Sadie's voice, and Helen surrendered. "You are doing a very rash thing, Sadie," Helen lectured, striving to draw her brows into an expression of impressive solemnity. "My own terrible experience should have been a lesson to you, a warning, a—" "But it was Whitney Barnes who saved you, Helen," cried Sadie exultantly. "You owe it all to him, and that is why I began to love him." "Nonsense," retorted Helen sharply. "Mr. Barnes had nothing whatever to do with it. All he did was to get himself handcuffed and run about absurdly trying to be unlocked." "But he was on watch and planned," Sadie defended her hero. "Sadie Burton, I say that Whitney Barnes had nothing whatever to do with it. He was merely an instrument. Travers Gladwin did it all. I owe everything to him. Everything. He would have gone to jail for me, sacrificed all his wonderful paintings. Oh, Sadie, it was wonderful of him." It was Sadie who was thunderstruck now by the ardor in her cousin's voice. Her amazement soon gave way to a beaming smile, and she mumbled as she turned to her dressing table, "I do believe she is in love with him." End of chapter 43. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 44 of Officer 666. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. Officer 666 by Barton W. Currie and Augustin McHugh. Chapter 44. Miss Featherington's Shattered Dream. Marietta Featherington couldn't seem to concentrate her mind upon that 13th chapter of Lily the Lovely Laundress. The handsome rat-catcher had just beaten the aristocratic villain to a pulp, and would have finished the job neatly and thoroughly, had not Lily raised her lovely fair hand and cried with the imperiousness of an empress, "Pause, Giovanni, pause! He may have a mother." Ordinarily, Miss Featherington would have raced through the pages hungrily, avidly. Not so on this fair November afternoon. Whether it was the mince pie and melted cheese she had partaken of a bare hour before, or whether it was the even more so than usual grumpy mood of her employer, Joshua Barnes, she could not tell. Perhaps it was neither. She refused to analyze it. Whatever the cause, she felt heavy and wistful and sad. From time to time the emotional Miss Featherington allowed Whitney Barnes to flit through the corridors of her imagination. He had walked heavily through her dreams the night before. His strange words of yesterday had strangely moved her. Desperately she had striven to solve the mystery. Were they words of love? If so, how would old grim Barnes accept the declaration from his son's lips that he loved the humble though beautiful stenographer lady of the Barnes Mustard Company, Limited? Miss Featherington had half expected to walk into Joshua Barnes's presence that morning and meet with a torrent of abuse. She had rehearsed a cold and haughty retort, but her employer had greeted her with a gruff "Good morning," and an expression that was equivalent to a smile. Alas, the prince had not spoken. Marietta pounded out 42 letters containing references to as many different kinds of assorted and selected mustard before she succeeded in dismissing the heir to the mustard millions from her romantic thoughts and creating a new hero in his stead. The new hero some way fell down, and she picked up Lily the Lovely Laundress. But even the lovely Lily failed to thrill, and she laid the book aside. A long sigh was escaping from the depressed maiden's bosom when the door of the anteroom opened, and who should enter but Whitney Barnes. Marietta swallowed her sigh and clasped her hand over her palpitating heart. The young man was not alone, however, and he did not deign Miss Featherington a glance as he held the door open and cried, "Come in, children." The children were none other than Helen and Sadie and Travers Gladwin. Nor did they deign Miss Featherington a glance as they assembled in a little group, talking in hushed tones and punctuating their talk with suppressed laughter. By the time Whitney Barnes did turn to Marietta, that young lady's nose was elevated to an excruciating angle, so much so that she was unable to fulfill her desire to sniff. There was cold hauteur in her stare as she met the smile of Whitney Barnes and replied to his query, "Yes, Mr. Barnes, your father is in, and alone." "Thank you, Miss Featherington," cried the young man, gaily, and an instant later the little party of four had vanished behind a mahogany portal. Joshua Barnes was bent over his desk writing as the door opened noiselessly and the four young people entered. When he looked up, his son, Travers Gladwin, and Helen were lined up beside his chair, the two young men smiling sheepishly and the girls blushing crimson and looking down at the floor. "Hello, Pater," opened Whitney Barnes. "You remember Travers Gladwin. This is Mrs. Gladwin, a bride of 67 minutes." Old Grim Barnes was on his feet in an instant, with a gallant bow to Helen and a hearty handshake for the bridegroom. For a second or two he failed to descry Sadie, who, as per rehearsal, was hidden behind the two young men. As, with a look of surprise, he spied her, Helen drew Sadie to her and managed to stammer: "And this is my cousin Sadie, Mr. Barnes." Sadie dropped a timid curtsy, her face on fire. "How do you do, Miss Joshua Barnes was feasting his eyes on Sadie's shy beauty and smiling benignly. "I didn't catch the name," he added, turning to Helen. "B," she began, when Whitney Barnes came to her rescue. "Barnes, Pater. Mrs. Sadie, that is. Mrs. Whitney Barnes, a bride of 77 minutes." Whitney Barnes beamed upon his father and put his arm about the old gentleman's shoulders to support him. "How do you like my choice, Dad? Isn't she a darling? Why don't you ask to kiss the bride?" Joshua Barnes breathed with difficulty for a moment, and his eyes blinked. Slowly he looked for confirmation in the faces of the newlywed Gladwins, and when they both nodded and smiled, he returned his glance to Sadie, who had turned very pale and was beginning to tremble. The Mustard King shook off his son's arm and gathered Sadie to him with a bear hug. He kissed her 10 times in succession, and then let her down in his chair and patted her shoulder. Joshua Barnes was so happy that tears glistened in his eyes. He continued to look at Sadie for a long moment before he turned to his son and gulped: "Whitney Barnes, you scoundrel! Have you been keeping this from me?" "Why, no, Dad," came the laughing answer. "I telephoned you about it last night, and you called me." "For the first time in my life I made a mistake, Whitney Barnes," his father checked him, "and you both have my blessing 1,000-fold, provided you will take me in as a boarder." "Done!" exclaimed Whitney Barnes. The End. End of chapter 44. Recording by Roger Melin. End of Officer 666 by Barton W. Currie and Augustin McHugh.